If I may. I'd like to call the work session to order. Thank everyone for coming. I just have a short introduction on what we're doing today. This work session is the first opportunity of the Board of Trustees to discuss the Crystal Trail project since the rollout of information in September. The reasons for that are we typically don't talk about projects while public comment periods are open. We don't want to influence public comments. We have laws on open public meetings, and those laws don't allow us to talk in exec session on projects, so we don't do it. And I wanted to point out that this meeting is being televised and taped and will be posted on the website, so those that couldn't attend will have an opportunity to hear our discussion. I'd like to thank the public for their attendance not only today but at all the open houses and meetings to date on this project, and particularly for the thoughtful comments we received. We got all the comments in a binder last week. I think everyone knows it's over 500 comments. The content of those and I'd like to emphasize the content was a lot of well thought out comments. It's not just a vote on A or B per segment or whatever. It's really the issues and concerns that were brought up in those comments that are important and useful for the board. Let's see. I'm in the process of reading all those comments. I'm about halfway through, I think. Like I say, we've had it for a week, and I'm working on it. I will read them all. I think it's very important information. I wanted to also point out that this is the first phase of the process, evaluating the feasibility of a trail and potential alignments. No decisions on alignments have been made. The objective of this session is, again, it's our first opportunity to discuss issues, give staff direction, determine what additional information we may need, and prepare to discuss with the BOCC in January. So we won't be making any decisions today. For some background information on how our board operates and the roles of the board, I'd like to ask Tim, our longest standing member, to kind of go through the roles of the board and the Home Rule Charter for us.
Thank you, Wayne. We hear about the Home Rule Charter as where this program is in the county system, and I'm just going to be very brief and hit highlights that I'm not going to read you the charter. The highlights of this program and what our role is interacting with the Board of County Commissioners in open space matters. 40 years ago, the county adopted a home rule charter to accomplish a lot of things. Limits on growth, limits on taxes, limits on borrowing, creation of citizen boards, and one of those was this board in 1990. It's a unique charter. Those of us who were involved, about a half a dozen of us, creating it, were amazed, actually, that all the unique features have, A, got adopted by the voters and the commissioners, and B, endured. So I'm going to just hit what those features are. The charter and the bylaws are sort of the laws that govern our program. Then we have policies. And the charter creates 5 trustees, one from each commissioner district. So we're geographically diverse, obviously have diverse backgrounds, values, but pretty much all the 16 or 18 people who've been on this board have been active in the community on public boards or nonprofit boards or whatever. And the fund that was created is a separate fund. That's the second point in the Article 13 of the Charter, is it's a separate fund. It's not mingled. It's earmarked and restricted to the acquisition and improvement of open space and trails and directly related expenses. The third thing, and truly unique, I think, in all of Colorado in terms of open space boards, the uses of the fund must be recommended by the Board of Trustees. And I'm going to just read you what it says. It's a very short phrase. It says acquisitions and improvements of real property. That would be for land like scenic view plains, urban growth boundaries, habitat, water rights, mineral rights, and for trails and trailheads, have to be selected, shall be selected by the Board of County Commissioners from a list of recommended acquisitions and improvements developed by this board. That's unique. And the next thing that we do as a board is establish priorities, and they change over 25 years as demands change, population grows, etc. There are always new challenges like stand-up paddle boards and parties on North Star, and we see overuse of areas, and so we establish priorities as we go. The last thing I'll say about the role of this board is we're very interactive with the Board of County Commissioners. Starting in about 1999, we set up a quarterly joint meeting, and we just had one last week. But beyond that, whenever we're working on something, an acquisition, a trail, a management plan that is really significant or has a lot of public involvement and public interest, we're very interactive with the Board of County Commissioners because they're the elected board. The last thing I'll say is that the whole goal of the 5 or 6 of us it was a citizens committee, we initiated the whole idea, and the then Board of County Commissioners put it on the ballot in 1990, and it passed 55 to 45. The whole idea was, how are we going to get this to work? How are we going to get trust of large ranch owners, long-time families, et cetera? How are we going to get it to work? How are we going to get people to voluntarily interact with and make deals with Pitkin County's open space program? And the key to that was 3 things. First, what the Land Trust calls the promise of forever. What we said was, we won't sell or convert anything we buy with this restricted fund unless we have an election and it passes, and a replacement property of equivalent conservation value. That was partly to get people to know if they did it, it wouldn't be changed into a transit hub or affordable housing or anything else ever. The second thing to engender trust was to try to have consensus, to try to work on things long enough as a board so we hardly ever act in a sharply divided 3-2 way. We're usually unanimous, occasionally 4-1, but consensus is key to that. And the last thing, in the prohibition on sale or conversion of lands, which was amended in the charter to allow it if in the ordinance acquiring a land we reserve the right to sell it. That might be a corner that we don't need or don't want or for development. That requires a supermajority, 4 of the 5 trustees, and under the bylaws, it's a supermajority to exercise eminent domain. And those are the highlights of the 2 things that control our activities and our interaction with the Board of County Commissioners. I think that's enough. So,
Thanks, Tim.
hope that's helpful.
The last thing I'd like to do as way of introduction is just let each board member briefly introduce themselves, where they live, how long they've served on the board, why they volunteer. Graham, you want to start that?
Sure. My name is Graham Means. I live up in the Aspen area. I first came to the Valley in 1971 and loved it and have been here ever since. I work as an architect. I have a wife and 2 sons. All of us are very active in the backcountry and on the trails. I'm sitting in this chair now because I believe in the mission of the Open Space program. I recognize the amazing achievements that it has done in the environmental field. There's a list of properties and projects that we've done that is lengthy, and a lot of that has been done in the Crystal Valley. Our program also had a hand in the Rio Grande Trail, and I feel that the Rio Grande Trail has been an incredible community link and a very successful project. So anyway, that's my intro.
I'm Hawk Greenway. I've been serving on this board for, I'm coming up on 20 years. And so I see my role on this board as a bit of institutional memory, because I've seen issues come and go, and I've seen us have incredible successes, and I've a few swings and misses, and that's been challenging. We've learned a lot along the way. I sometimes feel like my role on this board is to urge the expenditure of public funds for the purchase of public lands, particularly in public access to public lands, because while we have vast amounts of national forest and BLM lands here, we are seeing an increasing trend of closed-off access to those lands, which I think is dangerous for the future for the growing population here. I've been asking myself what in the world, why I volunteer. I see that's one of the questions you were asking. As we deal with contentious issues and get beat up in public forums, I'm reminded once again of the dedication that it takes to be a volunteer on a public board. And I think the highest, I scratch my head, what the reason that I volunteer is to make a difference, and I think the highest compliment that my ex-wife ever gave me was, Hawk, you have made a difference. And when I drive up and down the valley and I see parcels that took some badgering to get the board to see the open space value, that I feel like I can point to those as huge successes, not only of the program, but I feel like a personal involvement in getting some of these things done. It's just, it totally thrills me. I think the key for me is recognizing how much of a difference public lands have made in my life, and accessing public lands on public trails has been huge, and then realizing that these things didn't just happen. They're not accidental, that they're created. We get a choice to create the future landscape that our offspring and future generations get to access, and I just cherish my role in that for whatever it's worth.
Thanks, Hawk. Howie.
Okay. I think I'd echo everything that Graham and Hawk said. I hope everyone picks up this list of what we've created in terms of open space and trails over the last 26 years. So we've been at this for about a generation. I've been on the board 15 years as, I think, representative of District 5. Tim referred to the five Pitkin County districts that we all represent to create diverse coverage. Very simply, I'm here to, from a personal point of view and a community point of view, because I have a deep concern about our physical environment, its protection, its present and future condition. Having looked at this list, I see our job becoming more and more challenging, because we're kind of in a race against time in terms of property values, that we're able, outpacing what we're able to generate in terms of revenue. So I feel a real responsibility to try to manage our funds appropriately to get the most bang for the buck, because ultimately what we preserve, what we conserve, is going to be not just for our generation, but as Tim said, for forever. And that's just essential because we sometimes take it for granted that this landscape has always been protected. Well, it hasn't been. It's a constant struggle. County Open Space and Trails mission is trying to accomplish that. I'm proud to be part of it. It hasn't been without its controversy. That's why we're paid the big bucks to deal with these issues and come up with the best possible outcome, not just for the present needs, but for the long-term benefit. I'll say not picking county by itself, even though we're the funding source, but really for the watershed, the Roaring Fork watershed, which includes upper Roaring Fork, Crystal Valley, Root Eye, but down towards Glenwood as well. We really, I see it really being a successful valley-wide conservation effort that can partner with other jurisdictions, other conservation and preservation groups. Thanks.
Tim.
Tim McFlynn, and
I didn't test it. I live on Snow Bunny Lane, so I'm a suburbanite here in Aspen, and I've been here for now 45 years.
I've been in the valley since '87, and I got involved in this program in '89. And the whole idea of the group of citizens, when we banded together and asked the Board of County Commissioners if we could be sort of a citizen task force, was something that Howie just said, which was, if we waited, if we didn't have a fund, if we just waited for voluntary conservation easements with land trusts and there was no fund, we'd lose the battle and the valley bottom would fill in, and we can look at other counties where that's happening or has happened. So I've always lived in rural areas. I lived in Emma when we wrote the charter for open space, and I've been in Old Snowmass the last 24 years. That's District 4. That's Steve Child's district, which also includes Snowmass Village. And on the why volunteer, the staff told us we spend some 500 hours a year as volunteers, which this week seems like it's probably right. In that we've had this binder, and the charter says right in it, shall serve without pay. We put that in there for a reason. We were trying to distinguish the citizen board, like these people and the, 14 others that served before us, as really just volunteers, and sort of separate ourselves from the county that way by having this feel for each geographic region of the county that we lived in. And so ideas bubble up from each district, from us, and from people who have ideas. So when I think about why I volunteer, and Howie mentioned the list, and if you watch this on TV, you should get a list. It's available. In fact, we have 3 things in the back. We have the list of all the acquisitions since the first one, which was the Pepke Airport Ranch in '93. And it's amazing for us to look at. It's remarkable. There's also the packet for this meeting, if you want the packet, and there's a calendar. To me, the whole watershed is like a chessboard of possibilities. And this program has tried to be frugal, tried to be opportunistic, tried to leverage partners, tried to exercise patience and good timing, and it's been very satisfying and rewarding, and a couple of people have said every now and then a little challenging. And it's a humbling experience, and it's a privilege to serve. Thanks.
Thanks, Tim. I'm Wayne Ives. I'm the newest member of the board. This is only my second year. serving on the board. I've been in the Valley for over 40 years, in Pitkin County for the last 25 or 26 years. I live up the Crystal Valley in the Seven Oaks neighborhood, and I'm directly adjacent to one of the proposed B alignments, which would be in my front yard. I had a 35-year career with the Forest Service in land management that I recently retired from, and after being retired for about a year, you start to, well, besides going to work for myself in my own business, I started to look for other ways to stay involved in land management and public lands. And the opening came up to apply for this volunteer position, and I saw it as a way where I could contribute maybe some of my experience in land management to the program and stay involved in the important aspects of protecting, conserving lands and managing those. So I think I covered all my questions as well. So I think it's time to get to work. We kind of spent too much time on the introduction probably already. I have a few ground rules for the board. We have a lot to cover in our agenda today, and just ask the board not to repeat previous points. One of the objectives, again, is to give staff direction. So in order to save time, I'm afraid we won't have time at the end to wrap that up adequately. So during the meeting, if we have a proposed staff direction, in order to get consensus, if we can do like a quick thumbs up, thumbs down exercise, or a thumbs neutral, which means we really need to talk about this more before we give staff direction. I'd like to move through the agenda and at least touch on all the topics in our outline. And as ground rules for the public that are present, this is our first chance to talk about this as a board, so I ask those present for no outbursts or applause or anything else that might come up. Let us have our opportunity to talk. So with that, I'd like to move into our first agenda topic, which is the process, a discussion of the process so far, the lessons we've learned so far, and where we're moving forward at that time, or at this time. Anybody have a burning desire to kick that off?
Somebody's got to do it. In terms of the process, I think one of the most important things we need to do is turn down the temperature of this. It's been too controversial. I think there are people who are drawing too many lines in the sand. I think we need to, as a board, work to come up with a more collaborative process. A couple of things that I suggest that we might consider doing in order to do that. A is, I think we need to appoint some kind of a point person, consultant. I don't know the description of that person or how it is, but somebody to lead this effort who's identifiable, who has the trust of the community, who has the knowledge and the experience to lead a project like this. Secondly, I think we need to divide the project into sections. It's already been divided into sections in our some great work that has been done in analyzing this. And I think each of those sections needs to have, or group, maybe a couple of sections are grouped together or whatever makes sense. And each of those needs to have a focused process for each segment with public input, with more input from consultants as needed. And I think those two things are, we really need to move this towards a better process. We need to really consider those two things. I think what that would do would be to, this project has taken up a lot of oxygen from our staff, from our board, a lot of time. I think that would help to give our program more time to spend on the larger part of our mission, which is environmental in nature. We've got to remember that our board is advisory to the BOCC, and I think we've got to look at it that we're sort of creating a master plan or a master idea for future boards. We can't bind future boards to any amount of money or to any dream or plan. We can only go year by year. And so we are creating an idea here. We're not starting up the bulldozers next year or anything like that. We're creating a long-term process with a lot of input in the future.
Can
Thanks, Graham.
Can I add something to that?
I'd also like to add a
Okay,
few
go
things
ahead,
if I
please.
could. I agree with Graham on the need to slow this process down and cool off the temperature. As a resident of the Crystal Valley, I feel pretty strongly that the stakeholders up there need to be more involved and have the opportunity to be involved. And I think it's great, the 2 points he brought up as far as having a point person or a consultant lead the process forward. It would be helpful, and dividing it into sections is also, this is the biggest, most complex project the program has ever taken on. I do want to acknowledge the quality of the information that staff provided in the onset, the maps and the information provided by our consultants in an understandable way in a project this complex was really amazing. But moving forward, I think we just need to take more time and look at a breakdown of the whole trail system in segments and take that time to do it right. If this is going to be a forever project once it's done, or if it's done, and it's something that I'd like to be proud of, when it's done. Tim.
Thank you, Wayne. On the process, which is if you have an agenda, it's the first thing on our agenda. I'm sort of a process person first. I'm sorry. Can you hear now? Thank you. Usually I'm pretty loud, but anyway, I'm sort of a process person. I've worked the last 20 years in process as a mediator and facilitator, and the word consultant, which Graham and Wayne just used, I'd like to work on that word a little bit, because I think the way in which we went to Denver, we've done two analyses, what I would call fiscal and environmental. ERO in Denver did an amazing environmental analysis. So have others in the valley, so have others in the Crystal Valley. There's a lot of information on the environment that's relevant to if or where a trail should occur. Loris did the engineering cost report there in Superior. So we went to the Front Range to get consultants. And I know, and I've talked to staff about how there are people as expert who've spent their whole career doing public process. That's their specialty. They do this around the West, they do it around the world. We know some of these companies. One just worked on the Upper Roaring Fork management plan with the city and county. RAFTA just announced they're going outside the valley for a consultant on the e-bike policy. I think I would like to see us have the same sort of expertise in managing what others have said, and it's obvious, is the most complicated, costly, and divisive or controversial thing that the program has teed up as an idea. It hasn't been anything quite like it. I do know that the Rio Grande Trail, because I was here, everybody thought that was going to be the end of the world. It was going to destroy property values, and caucuses opposed it, and et cetera. So people resist change, but I would like staff, as a first staff direction and my first hope to get a thumbs up, that they look into available resources as qualified as ERO and LORIS just on public process. So I can talk more about that if I need to, but I think it was Redstone, actually, where we thought as a board we really hit a new high in a level of really good process. I think Gary and Lindsay did that process, I think. And it was very popular. And it wasn't as complex, obviously.
Is that for Elk Park area?
Huh?
For Elk Park?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a little wrinkle here and there. But Glacier was a process that most of us attended. Public meetings where questions and presentations were possible at Basalt Town Hall for, I don't know, close to a year, something like that. We owned all that land, so there was no land, who owns the land issue. But it was very collaborative, very interactive, and I think from the letters we're getting from not just the Horse Council, but the neighbors to the parking lot, people like the outcome. So I would like to suggest, I have another one I'll get to in a little later, but as a process thing, we get a consultant. And that you, with our help, search for who could be an advisor on that issue. Yeah.
Howie?
Since this is a work session, this is a Q&A and discussion back and forth, I presume, right?
Yeah.
I think that may be a good way to proceed forward, to sort of back up and see what we've learned from our 500 pages of input, public sessions, et cetera. I want to suggest another way to look at what the process is all about. One of my takeaways from the input from the public has been, I've learned a lot about the Crystal River Valley. I don't live there. Wayne, you do, so you're much more familiar with it. But this is really not only a trail issue. And I would think we'd make a mistake to have the process reflect a discussion only about the trail issue. The valley is a huge and wonderful natural resource that has residents in it, that has wildlife in it. It has to be looked, whatever we proceed to do forward, I think, has to include the trail, but it has to take a more holistic approach towards what's going on, not only presently, but in the future. Because so many of the inputs about why the trail is good or bad refer to some of these other features. And they shouldn't be construed, in my mind, as negative input. They should be part of the long-term, if you want to call it the Crystal River Valley Corridor management or future plan. This isn't my thoughts are not to, we can come up with a consultant that can tell us how to put a trail in. They can focus on that very narrow thing. That's going to be counterproductive.
That's not what I mean.
I'm against, but I think whoever we talk about engaging has to, I would like him to be talking about how do we deal with obvious problems that we've got that's been, what we've observed from the public input over the last 3 or 4 months. We've got a degraded river. That's part of we've got problems with the wildlife, particularly the bighorn sheep. These are all things that the public would expect us, as the sort of stewards of, per our mission, to be engaged with. So I put that as a challenge for us to define the job of and a focus of this consultant.
I have one further comment. I think to clarify, I think Tim's suggestion of a consultant and Graham's is someone to help manage the public process and further discussions of garnering more information to move forward. It's not to say, this is how you put a trail in or that kind of thing. The other point I'd like to make is that when the other two consultants we had input from the Crystal Caucus. We had a member on the selection committee from the caucus involved in the selection of those consultants, and I would recommend the same for this.
Can I just add one notion of, obviously consultants have a scope of work. That's, your idea is the scope be not a trail. My idea is the scope be a process. And I'll give you an example from the Crystal River Valley over the last 3 years. The Crystal River Management Plan, which started about 4 or 5 years ago with Roaring Fork Conservancy, low-tech hydrological, etc., had a lot of stakeholders. And if you think talking about people's land get their attention, try talking about their water. So what did we do? We went and got from Boulder an expert in public process, in stakeholder engagement, in seeing all the points of view, not as adversaries, but as valuable inputs, and had the skill to manage that process to a conclusion. It actually came to a conclusion. The same thing happened with the consultant, a nationally renowned process guy came in with the Aspen Hydro Plant, looking at fiscal impacts, environmental impacts, very divisive issue. Guy came in and did a marvelous job, had consensus. Everyone signed off on the outcome. And those were passionate points of view on both sides. So that's what I mean by a process person. And I'm not saying what they would do. I'm saying they could advise us by seeing where we are and where we need to go and what the pace is for getting there.
Well, I feel like quite the outlier here, as I feel like you guys are discounting our own staff expertise. I'd like to give kudos to our planning staff and to the public outreach that has taken place. I don't want to see this set back another 2 or 5 years because we want to study the darn thing to death. And in terms of lowering the temperature, I think the temperature is a good sign that we're actually getting something done and that we're doing some cooking. I don't think that you should request or require people to agree with everything that you've got going out there. I think it's, I want to emphasize what I think is just a wonderful input from the broad community with a wide range of opinions, some of which appear to be perhaps underthought or briefly contemplated, but some of which people have dug into this. We've had studies and studies on this, starting with Tom Newland, who came out with an alignments up and down price tags on that. And what staff has done here has broken this into segments. And these segments, when I look at the policy, or the process, I'm very happy with the process that we've used to date because we've had ideas, we've put them out in front of the public, we've had plenty of time for input, we've got more input on this than we've gotten on any other. That's, for where we are in the process, I think we're at the appropriate place. I do have some ideas that coming from public comment where people it wasn't particularly clear what was going on. I think one of them was the not having on the survey a big red button, no trail option. I think that was a fine critique of the process to date, although I think that was changed partway through the process. And so that we do have plenty of input of like, hey, forget it, just don't build a trail here. I feel like it wasn't particularly clear to all respondents that this was not an A or B option, but that it was a proposed alignments that could be mixed in places one and in places another. I feel like that, I don't know how you could have emphasized that to someone who was just briefly looking at it and going like, oh, it's either going to be on the highway or it's going to be on the old railroad grade or the county road grade. Whereas I think that there was a lot more subtlety in the proposal saying like, hey, this is a process that'll go through. So, that said, I feel like so many of the responses did understand that this is not all A or all B. So in terms of like how this process could have been better, I feel like there could have been an additional piece or two of information put in front of the public at this stage, one of which is illustrating or highlighting, I think it was in the verbiage, but not in the mapping as to where the county actually owns easements on the alignment B and where we do not. And to me, that was, and I think I discussed this with staff, and it's a question of, well, when is that appropriate to bring in? And that's a question of some debate. And personally, I think that should have been out there earlier. But I mean, I want to go back to this concept that that the process needs more consultants. We have an incredibly well-respected staff that has been through public outreach on various projects all up and down the valley with great success. And I like the local nature. These are people who live here. They're not experts brought in from Denver or from Salt Lake or from Philadelphia or something. And to me, that they're here. They're well respected. They've had an incredible, successful track record of reaching out to the public, getting public input, and then utilizing that information to come up with good plans. So I would have to say that I'm not interested in bringing in more consultants. I'm not interested in putting this program back another 5 years. I'm not interested in killing the trail through studying it to death at this stage of the game.
Okay.
I think the process is surprisingly successful.
Let me, since you were kind of looking at me, Hawk.
Oh, no, don't.
I'm just saying, let me say that the work that the staff did in developing and presenting materials, being gracious and respectful to everyone who came to every kind of meeting, was exemplary. No question about that. What some people called the heat. Most of the book of comments, particularly those at the end of the book, which is 200 pages of letters, not surveys that are anonymous, 200 pages of letters, including, notably, the letter from the current mayor of Carbondale and the longtime former mayor of Carbondale, said, please, tinker with and change your process. Slow down and be more inclusive, more transparent, more collaborative in your process. And I'm not talking about more studies. I'm talking like in medicine, when you need a specialist, you get a specialist. Sometimes you have to go to Denver. This is a special skill with people who has experience on river issues, trail issues, etc., all over the West. And I want to ask staff, and I'm going to ask you to ask us if we have a thumbs up enough to make this a direction before we move on. But I think it'll help everybody. People are livid with the process, not the alignment, the process.
Yeah, I took away that same thought, Tim, from reading the letters and from a lot of notable people. I mean, I know a lot of those people that wrote letters personally, and they're respected community members, and that was my takeaway too. That there were a tremendous amount of comments about our process, and I'm cognizant about not studying something to death, and you're never going to have the answers to every question. In my Forest Service career, we would always have that same discussion on a project. It'd be like, you just can't wait for every study to come in and every answer to every question to move forward. So I'm cognizant of that as well. But I do think we need to hit the reset button on this one. That's my opinion, and I guess we can call that question so we can move on. We do need to go through the process.
No question. We've got two good, two thoughtful positions on it, and we may need somebody to kind of be the process manager, if you will. One of the concerns I have, and Hawks expressed it, and I think we all want to take advantage of the hard work of the public input, the staff work, to see if we can come up with something that is beneficial for everyone and in the valley. So my question is, what kind of time frame are we going to put on our engagement of somebody else to get to a point where we can then take the next step? I'm not interested in a 2-year, 24-month effort or even a 12-month effort. I think this has to be done expediently and with a very focused set of direction from us. We all know we've done a lot of studies in this town and brought in outside people, and it gets lost by virtue of inaction. And so I think we need to say we're going to hold ourselves accountable to get something done. Otherwise, I think we're kicking the can down the road and being irresponsible.
I agree with that. We have momentum going on this project. There's no question about that. And I think we can set that timeline at a reasonable, keep the momentum going, keep it on the forefront, keep it in the newspapers every day.
Well, let's just stay on that. Are we talking about the end of the summer? Are we talking about the end of the spring?
We're talking about getting someone engaged who can help the staff and the board, because we ultimately have to make a recommendation for every
Let's put a date to it.
inch.
I mean,
The direction is for staff to come back to us with who and at what timeline. We spent $200,000 on ERO and Loris.
Well, we
Plus
spent
$300,000. We spent $200,000 of this fund. I want to spend whatever it costs to get a process person to help us. And if you read all the letters, it is a consistent refrain that the process is a sprint and it's not working as well as it should. So to rejigger it, I want to get a consultant. So I'd like you to call that.
I'd like to ask an information question. When you are talking about bringing someone in on process, where do you want them to start? Are you going to start
Start here. They don't have to look at, they start right here, just like the gentleman who came up on the Crystal River Management Plan. He started on the day he came up. And he was fantastic. That's because he has a skill set.
Comment from staff. Gary?
Well, I was going to wait until you guys gave the direction, because I was trying to clarify the evaluation of a public process consultant with the funding and everything. Would we evaluate it and bring it back to the joint work session, so
Or
you
bring
guys
it
both
back
get-
on the 11th.
um,
We can do it by our next meeting, which is the 11th.
You're talking about bringing that back to.
Well,
and
as soon as we
forward?
can. As
Okay.
soon as, we need it, that's all. I'm just
You
asking
need
for,
to, phrase this question, thumbs up, thumbs down, to get,
To keep
a
moving.
reading.
Yeah, I do think we need to keep moving.
To take a stab at it, I would say, are you, board members, in favor of researching, hiring some kind, or hiring or appointing, and maybe it's within staff, a point person to be an identifiable lead for this project,
Who's a process expert?
process expert.
I do.
Okay. Thumbs up, thumbs down?
Is that a thumb?
I'll go with it, but I want some time frame to this.
We can put that in
Yeah,
evaluation.
We
How
can
do we
put
deal
that
with
in the, we can bring that to the evaluation.
Good.
And because the way I'm hearing it, just to be clear from staff's wise, is you're looking for a public process consultant to work with us on the next phase when a draft plan is released with,
To work with us from the day he starts or she starts
right,
through the process.
correct.
I don't know whether that's going to be 2 phases or 10 phases.
Well, I know, but it would start basically once we have approval from both boards to do the funding for it. And because we don't have the funding now in the process, so to do the funding, because if we're going to take it through the process, it'll be relatively expensive. And so we just need to make sure that that is totally evaluated and then brought to you guys to make that decision in early January to move forward with that.
Yeah,
And
and
then
I-
we would bring that as the next phase is even introduced, that person would be on board and running the process. Is that where the direction I hear?
Yeah, and they work on a piecework basis, is it
Right.
2 weeks or
Well,
2 months or?
So how are you, up or down?
Yeah,
We
no, I'm
got-
up on it.
Okay, let's move
So we
on.
have
Okay, so we,
four
yeah, we
ups
can
and a
move forward.
down,
You'll-
is that?
Thank you.
so the last thing I'd like to say on that, I guess, is my thoughts on the process moving forward. Our normal process is we take public comment, we discuss it, we give board direction, we create a draft plan, we take public comment again, we discuss it, and we come out with a final. This project is complex and big enough that I think that normal process might need an extra step of, before the draft is actually developed, of working through some of this process moving forward.
I agree.
So with that, I think we can move on from our process discussion to feasibility.
Oh, I have one other suggestion on process. This is our very first chance to talk to each other. Up until today, we've talked one-on-one because of the Sunshine Act. And that is that we, going into 2018, check in public sessions on our agenda from here on out. And the last thing is, when I think about, and I've talked to some of the commissioners about, these things have changed the public process, have changed the world. Flash mobs and social media get all kinds of people agitated and involved. And I think a great retreat topic is public process. I'm just going to say that.
All right, well, that's actually on our agenda on the 11th, is talking about retreat topics, so we can hold that one. Let's move on to feasibility. I'm happy to kick this off if you want me to. Sure. On feasibility, the notes I made and the takeaway I haven't read all these comments yet, but I've read at least half of them. There were some asks in there as far as more information that I think would help us answer the feasibility and as it relates to costs later in our discussion. But I made notes on additional information needs on wide shoulders as an option. West side allotment was brought up by several people. West side alignment. my thoughts are along those lines, are a general cost savings idea for a more modest trail platform, not the Cadillac 10-foot wide paved guardrails. The narrow valley, it might not be an appropriate place for that. So I would like staff to look at, as we move forward, to look at more modest trail platform, and maybe to include only a single track the entire length from now on, from the KOA up. It's proposed as a single track from Redstone up and all the way over to the crest of Butte. The transition has to happen somewhere. Maybe it should happen lower in the valley to avoid some of these issues with such a narrow canyon. We could also look at, if we don't make a connecting trail, what segments could stand alone, and I think as we move forward, there's some options. McClure to Redstone, there seems to be a lot less controversy and issue with that segment. And if we can move forward on portions of it, even if the ultimate decision by this board or a future board is to not connect the two ends, we've made some progress, and we've created an amenity maybe that is important to the valley. So I'd like to see that looked at. We'll move it on to Sir Graham.
Do you want us to go through each of those, all of us?
I think you've,
Well, there's a bunch there, and
Yeah.
I don't want to dwell on a lot of it. It's a lot of the details, but maybe I'll hear from other people first.
I think you've hit on something that is absolutely key to how we look on this, and that is the concept of continuity of a trail. And if our goal is to have a trail that goes all the way from the top to the bottom of the valley, it's a very different thing than if that is not a key concept. In the near future, I see an awful lot of rocks and hard places to get to the goal of a continuous trail all the way through the valley, and to be honest with you, I think it's unrealistic in the near future. I think we need to think about a trail that connects neighborhoods as opposed to a trail that connects regions. I think, and when we get to our budgeting and cost, I think that comes in a big way. I support the looking into narrower soft surface trails as an option to connect neighborhoods. I think we want people to slow down and experience the valley as opposed to riding from Eagle to Crest of Butte or something. And I think, as I said before, if we break this process down into segments that have their own process, they can make their own recommendations as to what kind of a trail would work for them. And if widening shoulders is part of it, that's fine. But if there is, if a certain segment, they come out that we don't want a trail, I think we need to honor that. The big hit here is, of course, the continuity of the trail. But we have not, we got this sort of encouragement from the state to build this, but we haven't seen the state people here to present that vision. So I think we need to, as a board, decide whether we're trying to put a continuous trail through here or not. I think it's a difficult process. So I'd love to hear more about that.
I'll stay on that point about continuity from a couple of perspectives. I am strongly in favor of continuity and connectivity. You used the point about connectivity between neighborhoods, and I think that's a good image or vision for us to accomplish. Again, I think it may have to be done incrementally over time. We certainly haven't really dealt with the issue and real issue and respect for private property owners and their role in accomplishing this and how we manage that. That certainly has to be honored and dealt with. But in terms of the way I see it is connectivity. I'm going to sort of break it up in two parts. Is kind of the Redstone to Carbondale area and then the Redstone and beyond area. Perhaps part of that is to McClure Pass. I take a little bit of a different view than you do, Wayne, with respect to the platform. This, to me, is not a mountain bike trail. It's not a single track trail. It's a connectivity effort to go from Carbondale to Crested Butte, and it's along a platform that potentially that has a scenic byway already established. It goes all the way to Hotchkiss, Paonia, and over to the other side of McClure Pass. And I think we need to see that, in my opinion, if you're looking at it as a mountain bike trail, that's your vision, you're really limiting what the future potential of it is. Specifically, I'm thinking that there may be a sort of a two-platform approach. The soft service platform, which is often associated with alignment B, because that's, to me, that's really a calmer, more social, less transit-oriented type of area to experience and participate in accessing the Crystal River Valley. For transit basis, for traveling long distance quickly, then the 133 platform needs to be more carefully looked at. I think CDOT's got to be forced to be a player in this thing and not just sort of taken as somebody that we can't talk to. We got a commissioner on the CDOT regional board. I feel we can give him direction, if you will, that this is what we need to do to accomplish the transit portion of connectivity. People moving up and down the valley, whether going long distance or commuting to work or however you want to do that. We've certainly got the money, potential for the money, because we changed our charter to allow for wider shoulders on public roads. That should be part of our strategy. To me, that makes the feasibility of multiple alignments more doable, more accomplishable. With respect to other alignments, I've taken the Faloa Meadows Trail platform that's part of the alignment B off the table. To me, it's a non-starter. It doesn't. We need to be more creative in dealing with some of the challenges in that area. We've got a good management plan for that area. I think we should stick with that and come up with another alignment that gets us to and from the hot springs more effectively. I've got other comments, but we need to keep moving on.
Hand up first.
I definitely think that you could allay a lot of fears in the community by laying Faloha to rest, and it seems to me that's been basically a non-starter from the start, and that in that section we're looking at an alignment A, Highway 133 corridor, and that in terms of the feasibility of alignments, that to me is a very clearly feasible alignment in the A corridor there. In addition, I think that given the complexity of this, I mean, I have to say I have an incredible amount of trust and respect for the staff ability to dig into and do this in-depth analysis of the rest of it, and I think there's clearly some sensitive wildlife habitat areas that will also rise to that same level of non-starter in the corridor B as presented. So I mean, I would basically say as a principle, we got to stay out of those areas and that have shown up through the analysis. What I think is great, I'm completely I almost don't see the point in not having a continuous trail. It's like, what are you trying to do here? To me, I think it's important that we ask staff to highlight I would like to ask staff to come back with a draft proposal after analyzing the wildlife habitat that's non-starter places. I've heard them mention Janeway North and Red Wine Point, and driving by Red Wine Point, I look at that and I'm going like, wait a minute, this is at the bottom of these cliffs. The bighorn sheep are on the top of that area, which is closed, which is protected from, it's not a housing development because Pitkin County Open Space bought it. But to me, that's like with appropriate seasonal closures as recommended by what's now Colorado Parks and Wildlife. To me, like, that's a viable section to go on given those closures. So
I think we're going to talk a little bit more about wildlife impacts next. Yeah. So they all kind of relate. I mean, feasibility relates to cost, relates to wildlife. But Tim, you have...
I think Graham's opening remark about continuity from Carbondale to the top of McClure is helpful, because I think there are private lands and subdivisions, and we all know where they are, where we don't know that there is a permission by deed or easement or whatever to cross. And those private landowners, in my view, just like the Faloha and other equivalent wildlife areas, are areas that could still have, at least in the near term, the benefits of soft surface, meandering, connectivity between neighborhoods or community, all the benefits of what trails do. And I like what Graham and Howie said. I feel the same way, that we've walked everywhere we had permission to walk. And there are opportunities for solitude and contemplation and enjoyment of nature and a river that would not include mechanized users, in my mind, because it is a user group that needs safety, no question. Just like on every valley in the county, Snowmass Creek, Capitol Creek, Woody Creek, you name it, we have added shoulders, paving shoulders, to our charter just in November, so we can spend money that Public Works doesn't have, adding with paving or not paving. And so I think the direction I would like to see this plan, this is feasibility, we're on feasibility. I'd like it to look at not a continuous line, but a line that has benefits, is attractive, and respects, until there's analysis that tells us otherwise, these private lands. We have letters from entire families in one case, subdivisions, including your subdivision, Crystal River Estates, there's 4 of them actually, where we don't have an analysis. We asked for one and didn't get it. We don't have an analysis of whether there is a right-of-way that's public, and I don't know how you evaluate costs without knowing, if you want to have a continuous trail, without knowing the costs of acquiring the missing links.
I agree with that, Tim. That's one of the reasons I don't think we're ready for a draft plan. There's too much missing information to really come up with typical draft plan on a project. And private properties are a big concern. One point I wanted to make on connectivity is that on the governor's 16 for 16, the way I understand it is there were kind of two parts to that, and one was connectivity of communities, and one was getting people outside or living within 10 miles of a park or that kind of thing. And I think we provide that opportunity now on a lot of our open spaces. And of course, the National Forest provides a tremendous opportunity for getting people outside in this valley. I think we need to really look at the value of and the use of really connecting. When I first heard connecting Crested Butte to Carbondale on a trail, I'm like, who's going to ride that whole thing? I mean, there's a few people that will, I'm sure. I'm not a mountain biker. I'd gladly take a long, extended horseback trip on that route.
I'll go with you.
But connecting those kind of communities doesn't really make sense. It makes sense to me to connect Redstone and Carbondale if that's feasible. But there's a lot of issues in between there, so I don't think we're really ready to dive into that.
Well, let's just stay on that. If we could maybe go into a fantasy state of mind. Imagine if 133 were not the speed corridor it is now. Imagine if it had much more more safety along the sides for people who are not in cars looking at the landscape through the windshield. I think our discussion would be going slightly differently. We would kind of be dealing with a more easily imaginable or achievable connectivity particularly between Redstone and Carbondale. And the reason I'm bringing it up is one, I see that's a role of our so-called scenic byway. It should be safer, it should be more enjoyable, and it may be that we should bring to the table CDOT to be a participant in helping us establish a corridor, part of this connectivity that really gives us the opportunity to have less impact on the east side of the river, where there seems to be a lot of concern, understandably and correctly so. I mean, I don't think we should accept that the 133 platform as it is now it has to be the platform of the future, the condition. And it's the consultant whom we're going to engage should be able to bring those kind of players that are stakeholders in this experience to the table.
So my thoughts on moving this forward are for staff direction on this topic. I think that's an important piece. Part of it's understanding what CDOT's requirements are. I mean, sure. They have certain requirements on a state highway that need to be followed when you're proposing a designated trail along that highway. So I guess I would propose to staff kind of a multifaceted thing of more information. And one would be kind of a display of those CDOT requirements to help us understand that as it relates to widened shoulders.
Good.
A west side alignment, which was brought up in several comments, and maybe a more modest trail platform than the typical, or what we already have from KOA down, which is, we had more room there. If we can narrow that up in the narrow sections, make it more affordable, maybe more aesthetically pleasing, rather than when you're on that, you're kind of corralled between two rail fences for safety. I guess that would be my proposal for direction for staff, is to as we move forward, we need that additional information. Does that
I agree.
sound reasonable?
Yeah.
We want to do a thumbs up on that one, or thumbs down?
Thumbs up.
Okay. Gary, you have some clarity on that?
To clarify, because you brought up other ones at the beginning. You brought up that whole big list. And I think the list I was looking at is most of, widened shoulders, looking at, CDOT's requirements, that was added, but those first ones that you brought up were widen shoulders, west side alignment, narrow trail width, modest trail alignment, and add just single track, and you're talking about both sides.
I don't know that you have,
No, I'm not sure. We have consensus on the single track thing on that.
Okay.
So I would leave it at those first three and include the CDOT requirement. And I think this relates primarily to alignment A
Does.
for feasibility on that alignment. I think there's some other questions on alignment B regarding private property and wildlife, which we'll discuss next. So that was my,
We did have a strong clarity on Faloha, I thought.
let's do a separate thumbs up.
Yeah, I was
think
like,
it's
you
clear.
can
Let's
start
get it
talking
off
about the wildlife.
yeah, and we could talk about wildlife impacts first and then bring that in.
Okay.
Let's do
Because
it up or down.
It's your
on that.
meeting.
On
It's your
Faloha?
meeting.
Okay, no, it's not my meeting, it's our meeting.
Are we doing up and down on what?
So I got a unanimous thing. I think you have clarity now, Gary, on,
On widened shoulders, west side alignment, narrow trail widths, like that's going to go with CDOT requirements, and trying to show you all the CDOT requirements on that.
so
And
those
then,
four things is what I got.
That's
and-
that,
yeah.
we want more information on that.
Right,
Right.
that's
The
important.
one thing that he mentioned, Gary, was, and you, I know from not just this project, but other staff know a lot about CDOT requirements, and the first 5 miles up to the BRB was in the CDOT right away mostly, and some private landowners cooperated elsewhere. But the cost, the width, the surface, the guardrails, the cost piece, I think the idea was, are there less costly? I mean, this cost assessment of alignment A is $100 million or something like that.
Staggering.
Staggering. And it goes to the capacity of the program. So be creative, use consultants. How would Delta County do this? How would Delta County do this?
Well, let us bring it back. I don't want to discuss it right now because
But
we've
I
done a
want you
lot of
to
that
add
already.
costs.
But, the reality is, let us bring it back. The widened shoulders is a piece that's different than trying to create a separated trail
Yeah.
on the side of a highway. There's different width pieces of that. So
Good.
let us bring that back so you guys can keep moving forward.
Okay, let's keep moving forward, because I do want to we need to get at least through costs. So crack the whip, and time is running away, and we do have to leave, we have to vacate this room
Before noon.
before noon, so at 11:45, we gotta start clearing out. So, let's move on to wildlife impacts, and I'm ready to, if we want to do a thumbs up, thumbs down on Faloha alignment, I'd be glad to do that first. So,
No alignment.
what we're saying is no alignment through Faloha Meadows is our recommendation, to stay on the alignment A highway on the Faloha segment.
Implicit in that is we keep the management plan guidelines as we presently have.
Yeah, I don't think we're saying we're
No
going to
change.
change the management. I believe the management guidelines we have in the Faloha management plan are working fine, which allows some public use on that trail for a short period of time. But as far as a connected trail
Yeah.
in the Crystal Corridor.
Yeah.
So we got a unanimous, Tim, did
Yep.
you? Okay.
You're not going to stop with Faloha,
But
though.
I'm not going to stop with Faloha. Wildlife is, it's way bigger than Faloha in my mind, and whoever wants to kick that off. Graham, you want to
I
start
seem to be the kicking off
kicking off guy?
here. Anyway, wildlife impacts have been identified by everybody on all sides of this thing. They're obviously very important. We've got a lot of good work that's been done to address that. But I think we got I think in some ways, the wildlife has been stressed and sacrificed as other environmental qualities. I think it's simplistic to say there are wildlife issues on alignment B, therefore put it on alignment A. In my mind, alignment A, in many sections, is a very urbanized trail that is cantilevered out over the river. It takes tons and tons of concrete and steel. We got to think about the carbon footprint of what that's all about. And so I think in the larger environmental picture, and it certainly takes into wildlife, we've got to be concerned with impacts to the river and the bigger picture of the environmental consequences of a massive construction project. And so wildlife is certainly important, but it's not the only thing. In terms of seasonal restrictions, I think we need to go segment by segment. I think there's some places where they could be applicable and useful. It would depend on the access. It would depend on the sensitivity of the wildlife, how effective CPW and we think that those closures would be effective. So I think we need to take it segment by segment, but I think we need to keep seasonal closures on the table. In terms of what we've got biodiversity on this agenda, and of course, we need to use the best available science we can get. We've got a lot so far, segment by segment. We probably need more focused information, but the biodiversity policy is part of our program, and we need to apply it to all segments as we go along. And I kind of look on these as sort of breakout segments that are dealt with by, again, a focused group of more consultant information as needed from wildlife and engineering, etc., along with more public comment on each trail. And the way I see it, these segments might then come up with a plan and then bring it to us for funding and say, we've got some kind of a consensus on this certain segment, and we'd like to bring it to you and see if you would fund this. Obviously, it won't be this board, it'll be future boards. We can't bind those future boards, but we can set up a process where they can take a look at segments and make decisions on how to fund them.
Tim.
I'm going to just start with a reference to the purposes of the program in the charter that I talked about earlier. And the number 2 purpose is protecting natural biodiversity, including but not limited to incorporating or protecting significant wildlife, habitat, connectivity, and corridors. I just read that from the charter.
Diversity section.
Yes.
Yeah.
And as we're learning, biodiversity is a much, much broader concept than wildlife. It's the whole mosaic of living things in a riverine environment, a corridor with a river through it. That's what biodiversity is. And I think it's largely unknown how much of this program and its budget and staff time and its acquisitions have been driven by habitat protection, a huge amount. Faloha is sort of the poster child. It's sort of sacred, but there are many examples that through all over the county where that's why an acquisition occurred. The biodiversity policy adopted August of 16 was a collaborative process with 7 conservation groups helping. They came to many meetings. The policy kept evolving, and the result of that work was, I'm just going to hang on one second. The result of that was to say in a policy that we adopted and that the Board of County Commissioners was interactive with. It's not in the charter, but it's in a policy. That recreation, which is one of our mandates from the beginning, it's open space and trails for a reason. It was adopted at a time when there was a big brouhaha going on about a trail right up here. Right up here. We had to reopen a trail. So, but this policy says that recreation is a qualified, I'll get it and read it if I can, unless someone has it handy.
On the last page of your
Yeah, it's in
larger packet.
Okay, in the packet for today, thank you for putting it in the packet. It says, with a whole lot of whereases, because we had a lot of authors. It says, whereas the Home Rule Charter sets out the purposes, one of which is habitat, but another of which is recreation. Sets out the purposes of the program in a manner that creates absolute goals relating to the protection and preservation of wildlife habitat, riparian areas, which was just mentioned over here, the river environment, and public lands, and gives a qualified goal, italics in the original, of promoting recreation not inconsistent with the foregoing purposes. So, the point I make there is that, and I think it's obvious, and people have already said it, but that policy has to be one of the guiding principles when you look at segments. It's not just Faloha. I actually read everything in this book, finally. There's a lot of agreement in the wildlife submissions by all sorts of people, not just ERO, but organizations that are all about wildlife and wild places, like Wilderness Workshop. There's a lot of agreement from Division of Wildlife Officers, former officers. John Seidel, who was here when I got here. Ian Carney, who was before that. And who's the one I'm forgetting?
Kevin Wright.
Kevin Wright. How could you forget Kevin? So I'm just suggesting that this approach is one where there are 6 areas: Janeway, Avalanche, Perham, Top of McClure, etc., that are mentioned in various studies. But Faloha is, of course, unanimous, because that's actually why this program bought it. I know who they bought it from. I know what it was going to become. I know what the county analysis was for land use and houses there. And I know what our management plan is. But it's not just Faloha.
I'd like to build on that a little bit because it's very related. I would just wanted to say, as part of our best available science, I hold the professional opinion of Kevin Wright, John Seidel, John Groves, the current CPW employee up there, in very high regard. It was really verified with our consultants, the work that our consultants did, and the work that Wilderness Workshops consultant did. They all kind of lead in the same direction, and I also want to emphasize my thoughts on the habitat connectivity. This isn't just an area where we have wintering big game and a seasonal closure can adequately protect that issue and adequately be enforced. This is connectivity to the riparian environment, connectivity from one of these segments to the other, where bighorn sheep or elk are moving from Faloha through the Narrows to Avalanche down through Janeway. And I think I'm very cautious of introducing new human use, especially like a paved bike path type of human use, into those areas. And frankly, I think it would violate in many cases, it would violate our biodiversity policy, which is one of the first things we worked on when I got on the board, and I'm very proud of that. So I don't know if we're going to come up with additional, I'll let Howie talk too, but I don't know if we'll come up with additional staff direction on this, but I think as we move forward, we're going to want to really think about this segment by segment. My vision of moving forward with a consultant on the process is grouping some of these segments together, not doing 21 different little analyses with each neighborhood, and it's like grab a few. I would say a minimum of 3 in my mind, and that's from Redstone to KOA, breaking that in half, about Parham area, and saying take this chunk, take the next chunk, and then Redstone to McClure, it can be a chunk in my mind. So that's kind of my vision of the process moving forward. So we don't get bogged down in this piece by piece by piece. We have to look at it in kind of grouping. But with that said,
well, it's a good point. But Graham is talking about taking that section KOA to Redstone and recognizing the differences of areas, and they may have to be certain areas have to get more attention than others, particularly the areas that have been identified as having wildlife impacts. As a disclaimer, my comments may be just a little bit controversial, and maybe that's because of my background in metrics and finance and banking and things of that sort. There's no question that that impacts, there'll be impacts on wildlife from a trail or whatever platform. But I don't see any metrics as to what those impacts are. Are they going to impact reproduction? Are they going to impact access specifically to the river? I'm mindful of the emotion that's attached to it, but to say just because they're wildlife impacts, it's a non-starter, I think that's too superficial as a decision process. I need a little more specificity and guidance from the so-called experts. You've mentioned several. I would like staff to be able to bring into the discussion some data that would show that this kind of activity is going to have some impact. I just can't do it automatically on good faith. Maybe it's because we all have anecdotal experience of deer and elk crossing the roads, and we say, where are the impacts? And if there's hunting in this area, and all this game definitely has impact from people going off of trails or walking up into their habitat and shooting them. That's not brought into the equation of impacts. And I say it seriously. The impact of the additional 350 houses that are going to be built in the valley, that's going to change the impact on the wildlife. So I think we've got to be mindful that a platform in and of itself should not be singled out as the only impact that's going to be affecting wildlife. And so we can be fair to that. A lot of comments were made about the impact of the trail on bighorn sheep. Maybe I'm the only one thinking about it, but something doesn't compute here. 40 years ago, the bighorn sheep were 200. We get a healthy herd. Almost 2 generations later, we've got 40 left with a mortality rate of 90%, a 90% reduction in population, and there's nothing being, and there's a claim that the trail is going to negatively impact the bighorn sheep. I think the damage has been done by inaction and poor management of the bighorn sheep, both by DPW, Pickens County, some of the local wildlife advocacy groups. We haven't taken that responsibility on. To me, it wouldn't make any sense to build these trails, whatever they are, soft or hard platform, and let the bighorn sheep disappear. No one's convinced me that they're not going to disappear based on the last 40 years of trending. So I see that as part of our responsibility if we're going into a connectivity process between Carbondale and Redstone, that the wildlife have to be part of our responsibility. A management plan engaging DPW, Forest Service, ourselves, Bighorn Sheep Foundation, whomever, so that we can say in 5 years, we've turned this thing around. I'd feel like a fool if we built either trail and someone says, well, there's the last bighorn sheep out there. It's like the carrier pigeon. So that's what I would like to see as one of the outcomes of our wildlife impact approach.
I appreciate that, Howie, and actually later on our agenda, if we get there, I don't know if we will, but we talk about wildlife habitat improvement beyond the trail. Tim, you?
Yeah, I just, we already are working, Open Space is working with the Colorado Natural Heritage Program, which did in 1999 a biological inventory of the whole county. No?
It was certain sections.
Oh,
Yeah.
it was called Pitkin County, but it's certain sections
Well, it
called
was looking at potential conservation areas.
Yeah.
And so that,
PCAs.
yes.
Forgot the acronym. And we have already agreed to work with that agency, which is, I think it's fair to say, the best talent. It's the CSU department heads in all the ecology departments that run the Colorado Natural Heritage Program. And they've been here a few times in the last 2 months to gear up for updating that and closing the gaps in that. There are a lot of gaps, including a lot of private property. So what I'm mentioning that because I see someone in the audience who is working to sort of get that to happen. And in the Crystal River Valley, and I know that's a process that takes a year or two, but in the Crystal River Valley, to the extent that other than Faloha areas can be based on science and we know which ones are as important, if not more important, than Faloha, that information will become available if that's a priority when they start their work. And if it's a priority that we help make a priority because we're going to help fund their work, that might make sense.
Hey, Wayne. I mean, I could help you with the other part of the agenda is basically staff was always considering, staff was always thinking that wildlife habitat improvement in the entire Crystal Valley will be part of this plan.
Yeah.
And so that could save you some time of discussing it because that, I mean.
And we've already done some things. I mean, we've contributed with.
We're already working on it.
Working with the Forest Service on burns, you know.
But I think we need to step it up. I think this trail project has kind of opened the door to a better conversation with other environmental organizations and CPW and everybody to really find solutions. And yes, this bigger project, we were working on pieces with CNHP before this, and this is not just a Crystal, this is an entire watershed review with CNHP, but I think I can save you some time and say that's going to be
Can I make
Thanks,
Hey.
Gary. Yeah, Hawk.
I just wanted to point out that while we've done work with wildlife habitat, we haven't necessarily done that much work with wildlife management. It's a subtle difference, and I think when you point out how accurately the decline in the bighorn sheep population, that has much to do with wildlife management as opposed to habitat. And while we've certainly protected habitat and we've purchased things like Red Wine Point and Floham Meadows, I think in terms of stepping it up to the next level, it involves our interaction with CPW for wildlife management in that sense as well.
Thanks.
We agree.
Graham.
I totally agree that as we move forward, especially segments being identified and worked with as pieces, we need to work with wildlife people. There's been a lot of study about the river and need to work with those people who have a lot of knowledge about it. But when we get to our funding piece, I think we've also got to realize that we're going to be looking to these people for funding. And if we're working with someone on improving the river as we do a trail, we're not going to be able to fund all of this stuff. And we need to be cognizant of that. And we're going to need to make partnerships with wildlife people and water and river people that include, collaborative funding.
Thanks, Graham. That's a great segue, actually, because I was going to suggest we've kind of already touched on impacts to river riparian. I think, as we move forward, that is going to have to be considered, and we don't currently have that information. So I think we could move on to costs if everybody's okay with that.
It's good.
Howie?
Just to take, we've a little further on the river riparian issues. I think what would be our goal with respect to a restoration objective with respect to the Crystal River Valley? And I'm not trying to create something that's too large, but we know that the highway department has really degraded on its riverbanks the river course. It's changed the course. It's got embankments are lousy. They're basically sterile. What would we want to accomplish with respect? What are you thinking of there?
My thoughts, you're right, it is a constrained river corridor, not just from the highway, but from the railroad 100 some years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Nature.
Yeah, and it's partially, it's a constricted canyon. But there may be some opportunities in certain areas, like in the Janeway North area or something, where we can, working with Healthy Streams and Rivers, who I also see is here, maybe we can look at some projects that could be multi-financed with partners to reconnect some of those wetlands, or that it's more than just the trail plan. I've heard that from staff.
That will be included into the
So it would
trail
be
planning.
included in
There-
the final whenever we get there, which again will take some time, but I think that's an important point.
Well, there's pieces that we're going to be working on earlier. I mean, there's pieces that have been identified by our consultants, and obviously working with Healthy Rivers and Streams and the Roaring Fork Conservancy. There's a lot that can be done, and that's going to be all in conjunction with everything that we do on this, and will be included into the entire planning process.
And there's a lot that has been done in that crystal management plan.
Right,
It's
correct.
a great plan.
Yeah, we have some great foundations laid for moving forward with this whole planning in the valley. With that, I'd like, amazingly enough, I think we're getting through our outline and our agenda. It's amazing. And I don't think it's attributed to me. But I would like to move on to costs. I know that's something that several members wanted to discuss and have some time to talk about. So I'll ask for someone else to kick that off as well.
Do you want to go? I'm happy to
Okay,
kick it off.
Tim this time can kick it off.
The consultant report, which is half of this white binder, on engineering and costs, I think was very surprising to staff and to us of how daunting the cost could be. And what I'd like to suggest in terms of see if there's some consensus for staff direction on the cost issue is costs that aren't discussed in that binder, in that report, some of which are going to be very hard to estimate. But I'll start out with, because I mentioned earlier, when I looked at the east of the river alignment, the costs over time, which could be a long time, of acquiring private lands, and if private lands aren't acquired, then there's gaps, and so that affects how much utility for a neighborhood or communities trail segments would have. As staff knows, it's kind of a chicken and eggs issue. We requested at a joint meeting in the summer, I don't know whether it was June or July, that an analysis of the east of the river alignment, a legal analysis of where there is federal land, BLM land, open space land, CDOT right-of-way land, and where there isn't, where there's private land. Some large and some small, but we asked that legal analysis happen because if, as happened up here in Hunter Creek, it was clear that there was a legal right of access, we just had to get it back. In the Crystal, we don't have that, and I just am calling that out because how does one come up with a preferred alignment, go from a feasibility analysis in phase one to a preferred alignment without knowing where you can go and where you can't go? That's just, to me, a huge unknown. Let me just finish. I'll just say a few costs. That's one. And it's not just economic costs, it's the likelihood that those private lands in the near term are available to us. And up till now, in the last 26 years, the whole charter trying to put things in it so that landowners and open space could negotiate arm's length transactions where you do it the old-fashioned way, you buy an easement or you buy a fee interest. To date, there has not been, in this program's history, eminent domain, but it is a power we have. It's a power that in the charter, it's a supermajority of this board to recommend using our fund for that purpose. So, secondly, the costs of mitigating impacts, be they wildlife or other impacts, a lot of the public letters and comments said, you got to be able to make sure that seasonal closures and their enforcement in perpetuity, people use that word in their letters, is going to be guaranteed. Guaranteed. I don't know how you guarantee anything in perpetuity. That's a long time. Maybe the monastery knows how to do that, but I don't think government does. But that's something we need to think about. And the third one is the opportunity costs of of what we can't do. This is a planning and outreach list that came out in October of 17, 2 months ago. It's a daunting list. And we always have an acquisition list. So I think, not that you can calculate this, but we got to know within our annual budget what we can afford. For how long? How big a chunk would be earmarked for how long to do any particular segment or alignment. So enough said about that, but the capacity of our program looks enormous, looks unlimited when you look at the spreadsheet. It's a huge, huge amount of money. And reauthorization added another $250 million over the next 23 years. Huge amount of money. Those are things that I would ask staff to help us understand, particularly the private land piece.
Hawk,
Well, I've actually done a fair amount of thinking about the private land piece, and I have a recommended approach or concept to it, particularly given some of the letters that have come in. And my sense of it is that eminent domain, while not off the table, per Rachel's conversation the last time we were with the BOCC, I think it's highly unlikely. I think that we could approach the private parcels. I agree with you, Tim, that it's a nut that has to be cracked. We have to address that in terms of understanding where this trail has potential to go. And I would like to recommend that we use the avoided costs principle on this. We have estimated costs for the alignment A, which is in a public CDOT right-of-way, some of which are tremendous. And then we have bridges. I think we can thread the needle up this. I'm optimistic in that we can thread the needle. That will mean in certain places, I think, putting in bridges and hopping into the alternate A highway corridor and hopping back to what I would see as a higher quality general use trail around private property. Excuse me. But if you use an avoided costs principle in the pursuit of agreements with private property owners, I'm not talking condemnation, but willing seller, willing buyer of an easement or of an access route, you could go to the cost to get around that private property as a way to get a handle on what's this section of trail worth to us, and then sit down and have a conversation with willing sellers. And the answer could certainly be no, we're not willing sellers, in which case we're threading the needle. We're building a continuous trail around that property in the highway corridor. I think that respects private property rights. I think it also gives the private property people the opportunity to say, this is what we want to do to be community spirited and to pay off our mortgage or to rebuild our bridge across the river or whatever. To me, it seems like that would be a reasonable approach as a way to move this thing forward.
Graham?
I agree with what Tim and Hawk just said. There are a lot of unknowns that we are dealing with here, and this is a huge program, a huge project for this program, and also very cognizant that we can't bind any future boards. So that creates a lot of problems. I'd like to bring a little bit of focus to what the capacity of this program is so that we can, apply that and be thinking of that. And so I've done a little sort of back of the napkin analysis, which not being a financial guy and totally understanding spreadsheets and stuff like that, brings it down to a more simplistic level, which I think is often very illustrative of what we actually have. So with our program and reauthorized out 20 years, after debt and administration, we have approximately $8.2 million per year to spend on projects and maintenance or whatever. Our legislation says that our board can choose between spending between 10% and 40% of that on trails. That's a big spread, $820,000 or $3.3 million per year that we can spend on trails. I think our board needs to decide where we should be in that 10 to 40% range. Obviously, if we spend more on trails, we're taking away from our environmental projects. And I think our board can sit down and come to some conclusion there. I'm going to suggest right now for some figuring that we come in the middle at 25%. That would give us $2 million a year to spend on trails over the next 20 years. Then our board needs to consider that we have other trail projects that we're interested in. So how much do we want to spend on the Crystal Trail in our trail budget? I'm going to throw in a big figure, which I don't think I'm comfortable with, of 65%. But I've figured it in here for this example. So if we were to say we were going to spend 65% of every year on the Crystal Trail and 35% on other trails, that would yield about $1.33 million per year to spend on the Crystal Trail. Now, I'm not saying that's the number, but I think we as a board can get in focus on that. And when we look at that, we can get GOCO money, but my understanding is that, it's not going to be significant. It might be add 10% to what we have. So, if we're looking at spending somewhere in the neighborhood of $1.4 million per year or something, we're looking at an enormous project here. And we need to keep it real. There's certain things we can do, and there's a lot we're not going to be able to do with this budget. I think we can partner with people on stream health and wildlife issues, but they're not going to want to spend their money on the trail itself. They're going to want to spend the money on these improvements. So I just think we need to zone or focus in on what our board thinks we can spend per year, and I think we need to be cognizant that we only have that capacity, and also cognizant that we cannot bind future boards, whether they're our board or whether the BOCC or anybody else. So I think we need to understand the realities of our program financially.
Howie?
Graham, I'm so glad you did that, because I think some of these large projects or programs we get excited about, our eyes are bigger than our stomach, and that being able to handle, digest the responsibility that comes with it. We really don't have the ability. We're not going to have much money from the state to make this thing happen. Cynically, I think the state sort of teed this up and got excited about it, and then left the financing to the local jurisdictions and all the challenges that go along with it. I'd like to think, two comments. I'd like to think we could avail ourselves of partners to accomplish or create or raise additional funds. Anything that involves the rivers, let's talk about that, the platform, the impact from bridges on the rivers. We would talk to our fellow county Healthy Rivers and Streams board. They get $1 million a year from publicly created mill levies revenue. So that money can be looked at as a source for projects, particularly since we've identified the Crystal River as having a degraded riparian area. So they should be a partner in that. I think the platform on 133 that we talked about at the beginning should involve both collaborative funding between us and CDOT. It's going to take some pressure on those guys for them to be willing to come to the table, because they've been reluctant, and I know they have their own standards, reluctant to work with us. But I see that's essential to maybe accomplishing some of the other objectives. Dealing with wildlife issues like the bighorn sheep, we're going to need to partner with DPW or BLM or Forest Service on that, because they've got to bring some and locally raise monies, perhaps from Wilderness Workshop, to help us have a strategy on accomplishing that. So we're not perceived as the only source, the only required funder of these objectives. I'm not sure.
To comment on that, you know, I think they'll be willing to spend their money on water, river improvements, on wildlife improvements, but I'm talking about the trail platform itself. You know, maybe CDOT in certain instances, but, you know, that's what that's what I'm talking about.
Okay.
And that's where I don't think we're going to get a lot of.
Yeah, I don't disagree. We may be in the $2 to $3 million range, 2 at the low end, 3 at the optimistic high end per year, going out for 10 years. So I think a challenge to staff would be, if we've got a cash flow of between $20 and $30 million, using your approach, which I think is very, very thoughtful, what's reasonable for us to be able to accomplish? What can we reasonably accomplish, not just throw up our hands and say, well, we can't do it because we don't have enough money. So I see that as being part of our fiscal responsibility. I'm not. My other question was, I'm not quite sure what you mean by not to bind future board members, the future boards, because we do that all the time. We buy property, we issue bonds, we build trails, we acquire, we do ag leases, we do things like that. So I'm not quite sure what you're really concerned about there.
Well, you know, in capital improvements, I think the only way we could bind future boards is through bonding. I'm not sure we're going to do that. We haven't really talked about that. Maybe that's something we need to talk about. But absent that, we can't say that the board, even next year, is going to spend $2 million or something on a certain project. They'll make that decision, I think. And again, we recommend to the BOCC, of course. But that's their decision, not ours. I think if I'm wrong, we should clear that up.
Well, I hear what you're saying, but I think it would be reasonable for us to, in a hypothetical, to say if we have an agreed upon plan, we see that it's got a price tag of $20 million, to pick a number, and we're in agreement to accomplish that, and the BOCC is in agreement to accomplish it, and I don't know all the details of it. I think it's totally reasonable for us as a board to say we're going to undertake that. We're going to have a 10-year plan or whatever it takes to accomplish it, as opposed to each year budgeting for something. I think we have to, because this is a capital plan, we should be able to be comfortable that we can commit ourselves to a long-term plan. We talk about vision. Vision takes a long-term commitment from a financial point of view. So I'm comfortable with it.
Well, you might be right, but I think we need to identify how we're going to do it.
Okay.
I don't know, but again, I'm not a financial guy.
I think to your point, Howie, we also have a mandate from the voters who have put this money at our disposal for this purpose.
Yeah.
And so it's important, I think, to keep that in mind as well. It has been our practice in the past, coming forward, that we don't restrict ourselves to the 10 to or 15 to 40% per year, but we look at the overall length of the program. So it is possible to say we've got a $20 million amount available, dedicated to trails, and then use your approach, Graham, to determine where that goes.
I'd let Gary weigh in.
Well, I just wanted to clarify the 2 points that were being made about binding future boards. You know, really, truly, the funding is always an annual basis. So you cannot, even if you create a plan that says you're going to build this in 7 phases, you know, you can, in 1 year, budget for one of those phases, but you cannot bind future boards to continue that plan. They can change the plan, they can change the funding. A different BOCC and a different open space board can completely change that in the future. So you are correct. You can't bind them to the future, but you can create a plan and start implementing it while you have the board support to do that. But you can't say that in 1 year you can't budget what you don't have. So you can't budget $30 million because you don't have that in every year's budget.
Well, that may be true, but you can use your bonding authority to create funding for a capital project, and that effectively binds the board. We did it up on North Star.
That's different. If we want to talk about bonding, that's
And that's a
different piece.
conversation, that's a whole conversation that could come up
Yeah,
some other time. I want to kind of remind us, we got about 5 minutes before we have to start.
you got a little bit more, but
But,
Crack
so,
the whip here.
and maybe we can continue discussion on costs and that, or we can move on
Have
to,
we been clear enough on cause to give direction? Did we synthesize or thumbs up anything?
I don't think we've,
I think
that.
if we have 5 minutes or whatever we have,
Did you need any direction, Gary, now?
well, I got some on the cost. I mean, to me, that it's
what do you have?
the direction I got was, you know, obviously, you know, you guys are concerned about the range of what this project can do, and also the fact that we have a lot of other potential projects on that. I think, you know, when you started talking about the feasibility section, you talked about widened shoulders and other things and trying to come up with costs that are not in the $50 to $100 million range.
Right.
So I think as we move forward, as the plan keeps moving forward, that is going to be taken into consideration. And, you know, I think one of the things that I think future meetings will have to do is kind of work on Graham's, you know, kind of idea of what this board is comfortable with in the budgeting of the Trails Fund compared to the other relative funds. What you have in your packet, staff put at, you know, in the budget for this year, and, you know, we showed 15% and what 15% would do, and we also put in this packet, you know, the range of those. But so in the end, the staff direction is it's not easy on this one because we don't have all the pieces put together, but I think we realized and we knew that we had to find a way to kind of where Hawk was going was we're going to hybridize the project to also make sure that this program could handle the feasibility of costs for this project and all the other priorities that we have. And you have, I just checked, you guys do have till noon to keep discussing.
I think this is less a staff directive than a board directive. I think we need to do our soul searching and say where are we gonna be in that 10 to 40%? Why are we in these chairs? Or is it more environmentally? Is it more, we need to make that judgment and give that direction to staff. And likewise, we need to look at all the potential future trail projects, and it's very difficult to digest all of that, but that's what we got to do, and make up a percentage of what we think we can spend every year on the Crystal Trail. So I think that's a board thing that we can get a little direction from them, but I think that's on us, and I think we ought to all be thinking about that in the next month, and in January, maybe try to come up with those numbers.
well, I think it would be helpful as the process moves forward. I mean, it's a ways out from turning a shovel on this.
I think.
We have to keep that in mind. I'm not sure we have to come up with some hard numbers. I mean, we do that every time. I mean,
Yeah,
we
they're
do that
soft
multiple
numbers,
times.
but
We do that
numbers.
multiple times a year, is my point of looking at where we're at with our budget and what we're accomplishing. And
Right. Can I just add a
go ahead.
footnote to Graham's suggestion, and I think it's a very good one. I think everyone supports your suggestion. That's why we're here, and that's our responsibility. I think in terms of a staff direction, these lists that are spreadsheets of things that are 5 years out, 4 years out, 3 years out, et cetera, we do these 5-year plans plus acquisitions for other reasons. I think it would be helpful for staff to give us how these costs of this magnitude will impact other specific things that we're already doing. There are ones we're already doing, spending money on. There are ones that we know we need to do out of the trails side of the program. And instead of us who don't have the detailed knowledge the staff has, I think it would be great if you would create a spreadsheet or whatever you want to create that shows the impact on our capacity of numbers of this magnitude, even though we don't know where that money might be spent. Because if segments are the beginning, we don't know which ones, we don't know what they cost. But just generically, you know, all the things we know things that we're not doing and putting off until next year because we had such a busy 2017. So we'd like to see the capacity question addressed financially.
Dale has a point. He raised his hand.
Well, I just can't resist making a comment, which is that I agree with everything that's just been suggested. I just wanted to add my observation after having been at this for a long time with allocating this fund, that one of the great strengths of the program, and the reason it's been as successful as it has, in my opinion, is that it can be opportunistic in the face of changing economic conditions. We had an amazing streak of luck with the first phase of this trail. We were able to build that at a time when the construction side of the economy was desperate for work, and we got it done for much less than we predicted. We've had other experiences where opportunities open up on the acquisition side that no one can predict because either of the economics of the valley as a whole or the economics of individual ranchers that might want to work with us. So that's my only caveat, that you can try to predict in 20 years out, but nothing can replace the advantage of being in a position to take advantage of changes that you don't anticipate.
That's a good point.
Thank you. Anybody else have their hand up on?
Well, can I follow on Tim's comment?
Sure.
So, to rephrase what I think you're saying, is that
Say it better.
under our authorization, our trail acquisition construction budget range is 10 to 40%.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, we upped it.
Right, we upped it.
Actually.
Are you thinking, and maybe I'm encouraging it to go this way, that we can, to speak to Graham's question, we've identified certain trail needs, trail requests, let's put it that way. Crystal's one, Castle Creek's another one, a major one, plus we have other gaps that we've looked at.
There are
To,
a dozen.
to do a what-if, ask staff to do a what-if that says, okay, under 15%, we can do this, under 25, under 40, we can do these things. So we get a sense of this timeline, back to your point about obligating future boards to something we maybe, not at the time we make the decision, but it turns out we were way off base in terms of undertaking. So what were they thinking kind of question. So I can see that as part of our discussion.
I think it should
to make a decision, and I would like to suggest, since we've got this this freight train going here, we need to deal with this earlier than later, and not so we have a realistic budget to build around, to work from.
You're the next chair, so.
Well, have it on my desk by next week. Once you give it to me, then I'll take over.
That'll be in May. Can't wait.
I think, staff has pretty good direction. I think one of the things we can do too is, you've built up a little bit of a balance. We haven't done a big trail project in a couple of years. So, kind of looking at that too, we could provide a spreadsheet with all of those opportunity costs. And, one of the things that truly wasn't always talked about was maintenance costs too. And, that is a piece of all of this. Once you build things, you have to maintain them. And we've been doing a really good job with being as frugal as possible. And now that with the reauthorization, we're able to move a little further in the maintenance. We don't want to go too far to take out, capacity to acquire more lands and to potentially build some trails. So we can do that as a staff analysis.
Yeah, that was a big thought process through the reauthorization is as the program grows, you acquire more, you have more to deal with, that you have to spend more than that 15% cap we used to have on maintenance, and will gradually, in the next 20 years, that will continue to grow. Well, we only have a few minutes left. I'd kind of like to, I'd like to touch on aesthetic impacts. We've already talked a little bit about wildlife habitat improvements and stuff beyond the trail. We haven't talked really about the aesthetics. Briefly, I brought that up as one of the things of the full Cadillac 10-foot wide trail along the highway. Just the aesthetics of having those guardrails for safety and CDOT's requirements. That's a consideration I think we need to carry forward. But ask the rest of the board if they have thoughts on that. Hawk?
I was struck by how many comments from the public came in with approval for soft surface for this section. Many said, well, I'd prefer to have a paved trail, but I'd be happy just to have a soft surface type of thing, and particularly on east side locations in terms of the neighborhood ambiance, how much support there was for soft surface, and I'm wondering if that was reflected in the cost calculations there.
Okay, Graham?
I agree. I think, I'm sort of afraid of an urbanized front range type trail going up to Crystal Valley. That's not something that I think we want to.
I think many of the residents up there would agree with you on that.
Well, yeah, I don't think it's just a NIMBY thing. I don't think we want to do that. And I don't think we have the money to do it either. And I don't think we're going to find the money. So I think as Hawk is saying, we need to concentrate on lower key types of trails, and again, kind of think about connecting neighborhoods where maybe a kid can get on a bike in one subdivision and ride up to his buddy's house in the other one, and things like that, and not have the vision of road bikes, kind of racing up and down the valley.
Howie?
What we haven't talked about, and I think it's part of the aesthetic, the experience. Include that in the idea of aesthetic. I think we're on the right course to avoid the metro urban trail look. But the bike world's changing, and it's changing very rapidly with the imminent arrival of e-bikes. We're dealing with that in the Roaring Fork corridor, and we're dealing with it in other counties in the RAFTA process. And I think we shouldn't be caught off guard about the e-bike impact on whatever we ultimately design and implement, I'd put on the table personally, because I think we've sort of, I sense a board a consensus that the soft service and the hard service sort of represent different experiences for not only for the users, but for the neighbors, for the residents who live there, and perhaps for the wildlife that cuts across it. Not to get in the weeds, I would like to put on the table that e-bikes, which would be coming, would only used on the hard surfaces, and that would really be in the Highway 133 corridor to accomplish the connectivity we talked about, and not on the soft surface. Now, this may be special to this area, and it may not be the same rules in the rest of the Roaring Fork watershed, and so we'll have to deal with that. But that's the way my mind is going with respect to recognizing impacts, experiences, and building support for the end built environment.
Tim?
And I would just echo that sentiment, Howie. I agree that not only have no decisions been made about surface or width or location, but the experience of people on trails, we all value, we all use trails, and probably because of my, I'll just call it seasoning age, I know when we got together, there's one person in this room who was part of putting the charter together, we all sort of were worried, we were motivated by preservation of the amazing valley that we're in and the amazing county that we're privileged to live in. And I, at least, and I think all those people, subscribe to the Joni Mitchell anthem. Don't it always seem to go, you don't know what you've got till it's gone. And I say that because it's so true. It's so true. We don't take trails out. We create them, and then we're not the Forest Service. In a travel management plan, they took a lot of trails out, mostly because they didn't have the resources to take care of them. So I think the opportunity to look at all these factors where the mechanized devices of the future, the hovercraft or the, what do you call that wheel that's electric that you can, like a skate? One wheel. I think, I'm just speaking for myself, but I almost lived in the Redstone area when I moved here 30 years ago, and I think the east side of the river, for all kinds of reasons that we've articulated, is one of those places where mechanized devices, e-bikes and all the rest, really don't belong. And I heard Howie say the same thing, that people who want to work out, and there's nothing better than bicycling for your health and for commuting, for kind of mind, body, spirit experience. It's fantastic. But it affects the people you whiz by. And so I think, and maybe this is more grandiose than we already are with the plan, I think the east side should be non-mechanized. That's my personal view. And you said bike to your neighbor's house. I'd say walk. Myself, you know.
So are you suggesting no bikes on
Well, we have to look at it segment by segment.
I would
I mean,
agree
to
with
me,
that, but I
to
totally
me,
agree with
if
the
you're going to eat
non-
an elephant, you do it a bite at a time. I think you have to do it segment by segment. And, but I think there are areas there that we own, no question about ownership, that are so special that they would be wonderful areas for a quieter user group. That's just my personal view.
I agree.
Thank you.
I think to segue onto that, there's a bill before Congress right now to allow bicycles, mechanized use in wilderness.
I know.
And personally, that scares me to death because wilderness is very sacred to me, but those kind of things can happen in the future, and that could affect the what happens adjacent to our trail or accessed from this trail that we built. Unintentional consequences, I guess, is what I'm getting at. So with that, we've only got a couple minutes. I want to just touch base with staff. I think we've given several clear directions, and I want to make sure, Gary, that you're clear on what you've gotten so far, and we'll be having more conversations in the future. So,
Yeah, I mean, right now, I think I'm clear enough, and I can bring anything back at a future meeting of further clarity, just so I get a chance to talk to the rest of the staff who's listened to your conversation. And, I thought you guys could do it, so.
You were right. I didn't think we
You
could,
kept-
but we did.
I didn't think we could either. When I saw the outline we put together, I thought it was way
2
too long.
days, not 2 hours.
But thanks to everyone. I'd like to recognize the staff again for the outstanding work they've done so far, not just on this project, but on all of them. Really, we get great support. And
Likewise, Wayne, we'd like to thank you guys for working at this great rate of pay that you have and helping the
got free
community
breakfast.
figure this out.
Yeah, we did. We got a
yeah,
Roll.
we get a roll almost every
roll and
meeting.
a cup of coffee.
Sometimes we get lunch.
We don't go over, I would move that we adjourn.
I would second that.
Okay, all in favor of adjourn?
Thank you.
Aye. Thanks, everyone.
Enjoy the solstice, the return of light.
Good job, Wayne.
Darkest day.
Just there.
Thanks, everybody.
Return of light.
Good job.
Good job.
I need to use the restroom. Is that on tape still?
Yeah.